Welcome to today's event. I'm Cordula van Weyer. I'm the senior lecturer at the History of Art department at the University of York. Today's talk is of specific interest to me personally because I also have a research interest in the history of fashion. Today's event is part of York Festival of Ideas Online, although in a different format. The festival continues to aim to enhance York's reputation as a city of ideas and innovation through offering the highest caliber of public events. The 2020 festival has over 40 online events, offering an inspiring program for all ages. Thank you for joining us today. I can see that we have over 300 members in the audience. We hope you enjoy the adventure we are about to take you on. A few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the question and answer button on your screen. This is available throughout the talk, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to introduce our speaker for today, Anna Jackson. Anna is the keeper of the Asian department at the Victoria and Albert Museum, a specialist in Japanese textiles and dress. She is the curator of the exhibition Kimono, Kyoto to Catwalk, and editor also of the accompanying publication. Her major research interest is the cultural relationship between Asia and the West. And we are in for a talk of exceptional visual sumptuousness. Thank you. Anna, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gunilla. Lovely to be with you. Even though I'm not really with you, I'm just on my sofa in South London. So it's very nice to be with you all. And thanks very much for having me. It's great to be part of the York Festival of Ideas this year and to celebrate my exhibition, even though it is sadly closed at the moment. Some of you may know a little bit about kimono. It's quite an iconic garment. It's very much revered within Japan as an embodiment of sort of national culture and sensibility. And internationally, we tend to regard it with a certain sort of exotic fascination. It's also a garment that hasn't really changed its basic shape over many centuries. So as a consequence of this and its sort of symbolic status, we view the kimono as timeless, unchanging, a traditional costume. So our exhibition, Kimono Kyoto to Catwalk, was very much aiming to counter that perception and really show that the kimono has always been a highly dynamic form of dress. And also that despite being seen as uniquely Japanese, the kimono's played a really major role in global fashion and cultural exchange. So this is the entrance to our exhibition, and we sort of highlight some of the themes in our sort of opening case here. And looking very much at the chronological scope we deal with as well. So the first garment that you can see on your left is a very, very beautiful kimono from about 1800 that we've borrowed from a collection in Japan that really highlights the amazing designs that you see on the surface of kimono and the incredible techniques that are used to create them. In the middle is an ensemble by John Galliano, who's probably one of the designers in Europe who's really been most influenced by East Asian dress throughout his career. And this is part of his seminal 2007 collection of Christian Dior, in which he combines a sort of cylindrical line and the skirts and the overlap and heavy hems of kimono with a sort of Dior bar jacket. And on the right is a contemporary work that was created specifically for the exhibition, which is by Jotaro Saito, who's a modern kimono designer. He lives and works in Kyoto, but he shows his fashion on the catwalks of Tokyo Fashion Week, and he has a shop in Tokyo. So he's really our sort of Kyoto to catwalk story, if you like. The first garment, the historic kimono, dates from the Edo period. So that's the period from the early 17th to the mid 19th century, which is the first section of our exhibition. After what had been effectively centuries of civil war, Japan was unified at the beginning of the 17th century by the great military general Tokugawa Ieyasu. He became the shogun, the military ruler, in 1603, fought his last great battle in 1615. And he moved the capital from what had been the area around Kyoto in the center of Japan up to the northeast to a small fishing port called Edo. And that's the name that we give to this period, which lasted until 1868. This was a time of unprecedented peace, prosperity, rapid urbanization, a time when fashion culture really thrived. Kyoto remained the center of luxury production, and it was here really that a new spirit of sort of style and sophistication emerged in the 1660s. But the focus really soon shifted to Edo, which by the beginning of the 18th century was the largest city in the world, far bigger than about 4 times the size of London at that time. Of course, it's still one of the biggest cities in the world, but we call it Tokyo today. Here, a little later in the 19th century, you find these 3 fashionable women, and they're standing outside. They're enjoying sort of the pleasures of shopping for kimono, and they're standing outside the Daimaruya, one of the great kimono stores in Edo, in Tokyo. And inside, I hope you can just see on your screens, assistants are carrying great sort of piles of cloth to show customers. If you were rich, you didn't have to go to the shop would come to you, which is what you see here on the left. This is a sales clerk who's come from one of the other great kimono shops, Echigoya, which was founded in 1673 by a very enterprising merchant called Mitsui Takatoshi. He's often seen as the father of marketing in Japan because he really understood the power of the brand. And this is the start of the great Mitsukoshi department store that still exists today. And you can see the crest of Echigoya on the cabinet that the sales clerk has brought, and he's showing fabric to these 2 women. He's also showing the woman at the front a printed pattern of what her kimono will look like when it's made. And these patterns are very, very important in Japan. They were published in book form, and what you're seeing on the right of your screen is one of these books. And they were first published in the 1660s. And that's when you really see the shift, perhaps just to a gradual change of style, to something that you might think of as a fashion system. These books were produced in their thousands and circulated around the whole of Japan. If you wanted to buy a kimono, you would look at one of these books. You could either buy a book in a bookshop or borrow one from a kimono shop, and you'd go through and you'd choose what kind of design you wanted. It was a way of communicating with the merchants. But people also bought them just for the pleasure of looking at them, the pleasure of looking at the latest fashions, just as we would as a fashion magazine today. Now, there are thousands of these books, hundreds of thousands of these books that survive and in printed form. And there are many kimono that survive, but it's actually quite hard to find a pairing. So we were very excited when, I hope you can see in the far right page of the book, a pattern in a pattern book that belongs at the V&A, we have at the V&A, which actually matched a kimono that is in a Japanese collection. And we borrowed this from Matsukiya, who are another one of these big kimono firms that still survive. The word kimono literally means the thing to wear. And it's actually a relatively recent umbrella term, started being used more frequently in the 19th century. Prior to that, various other terms were used, but I'll use the word kimono throughout since you're probably familiar with it. This garment is actually called a uchikake, which is an outer kimono. So kimono are worn in layers, obviously more layers in colder weather, and elite, rich members of society, women would wear this outer kimono in the winter months, and it's worn sort of like an open coat, sort of, so it hangs, it's got this big thick hem which helps it to hang nicely. And these very, very long sleeves, swinging sleeves, they're called, they tell us that this garment would have been worn by a young unmarried woman. The kimono has a long history. It dates back about 1,000 years, but it was really in the 16th century that the garments, as we think of them today, became the principal item of dress for everyone, regardless of gender or social status. Now, you could easily just go to a kimono store, go to a merchant's, and buy a length of cloth and make a kimono in your own home. But those kind of everyday garments don't really survive. The sumptuous kimono of the wealthy, pieces that do tend to survive, these are really the haute couture of their day. They were always special commissions. And kimono retailers, the kimono shops, would orchestrate the skills of a great network of specialist artisans, designers, weavers, dyers, embroiderers to make the garments. So you might order your kimono in Edo or somewhere else in Japan, but they would always be made in Kyoto. And kimono, the main characteristic of kimono is that they are straight seamed garments constructed with minimal cutting from a single bolt of cloth. And they're worn, although this one's an outer kimono, they're generally worn wrapped left side over right, no buttons or toggles, just secured around the waist with a sash called an obi. So this conception of clothing is quite different to that which we think of as we think of clothing in the West, particularly as we think of fashion, because we're used to having dress styles that really emphasize or suppress certain parts of our body, whether it's the bust or the waist or the buttocks and so on. Whereas in Japanese clothing, the body really is quite irrelevant. It is actually the surface of the cloth, the surface of the fabric that is important. And that's a significant site of meaning. And it's through colour and decoration that a wearer would express their gender, their social status, their wealth, and their taste and fashionable sophistication. So this is the garment worn by young women, as I mentioned, of the samurai class, to wear on very formal occasions. The word samurai, people tend to think of samurai warriors, but they are a class of society. They are the ruling military elite during the Edo period. And this is a wonderful, I'm sorry, no image on a screen can ever do justice to these garments, but beautifully woven cloth. It's got a pattern within it. It's a bit like damask. It's then been painted directly on the surface of the cloth. It's been decorated with stencils, and it's also been embroidered. So these sort of very simple T-shaped garments that we think of them as kimono, they became like a canvas for a remarkable variety of designs. And this is why we tend to show them, like you can see on the screen, we show them on T-shaped stands, because really that's the best way to be able to see the remarkable decoration. And this is not just true of the V&A, any museum in the world will show these garments on those kind of stands. We also have the issue that the obi that would have wrapped around, they don't tend to survive because they get tied repeatedly, so they get damaged. We don't have the layers, so it's difficult to style things historically accurately. And also by wrapping them around a body, by tying some kind of sash around, you'd be in danger of damaging what are intrinsically quite fragile objects. So for all these reasons, we show them on stands. But the disadvantage of showing them like this is that we tend to see them as two-dimensional works of art. We forget that they are clothes. So one of the challenges we kind of set ourselves in the exhibition was to try and get our audiences, if they were going to understand that these items were fashion, to understand what they actually looked like on as clothes. Think of them as clothes. So where we could, it was we could do this only very occasionally, we decided to put the historic kimono on mannequins. So this is what this garment looks like on display. I mentioned that it was an outer kimono, so we didn't have to worry of having to tie a sash around it. But our wonderful conservators and our textile mounters very, very carefully constructed all this underpadding for the garment so it wasn't being damaged in any way. They made a cushion-like backing that is a bit like sort of the obi that we worn underneath. And also you can see we had lots of fun sort of with wigs and things to try and give this idea of what kind of hairstyles would be worn with it. And I think, as you can see, it gives you quite a different perception of what a kimono would look like when it was worn. And I hope you won't mind me saying, but we borrowed this garment, as we did many of the objects in the exhibition, from a major collector called Nasser David Khalili. And when he came to see the show, he saw this and said, gosh, that's a really beautiful garment. Who does that belong to? So I just had to say, well, it was his. And of course, he didn't recognize it because he'd never looked at it in this way before. You can see beside it, we did the same with a man's garment. And if any of you are interested, the blue garment you can see on the screen was featured in episode 6 of the BBC series Secrets of the Museum, still available on iPlayer. So the ruling samurai class were obviously important consumers of sumptuous kimono in the Edo period, but the real catalyst for the development of the textile artistry was an increased market for luxury dress driven by the growing affluence and confidence of the merchant class. Japan in the Edo period, there was quite a strict social hierarchy. The samurai class at the top, then the farmers, and then the artisans, and then the merchants right at the bottom. Merchants were just seen as a necessary evil who benefited from the labours of others. But in the prosperity of the Edo period and the increased demand for goods, it was the merchants who got rich. And they really channeled their money into pleasurable pursuits and the acquisition of luxury garments, including kimono. And as you can see from the quote, this kind of consumption was quite sort of what we would think of as conspicuous consumption. And it was the rich members of the merchant class who really demanded the latest styles. Now, there are no kimono of this age in European collections, indeed in most Western collections. So we relied a lot on being able to go to Japan. And of course, one of the great pleasures of the exhibition was to be able to spend a lot of time in wonderful Japanese collections, looking through kimono and trying to make a choice. And you see some of my people who work with me on the screen here, Professor Nagasaki of Kyoto Women's University and Dr. Oyama of Tokyo National Museum, both of whom were incredibly helpful in helping us to choose garments, to track down objects that would fit our story, and they both contributed to the book. Now, prints and paintings are another very good way of helping us to understand what kimono looked like when worn. So throughout the exhibition, we have this kind of imagery. And this print is essentially about fashion. It's early morning. This woman in the middle has just got out of bed. That's her bedding piled up behind her. She's having a wash. There's a bowl of water beside her and she's wiping her face. And she's sitting in front of a mirror and there are her makeup brushes and her combs beside her. One of her attendants is choosing a kimono for her mistress to wear from a rack where they've been airing overnight. And the other attendant is showing her some fabric that's just arrived from Daimaru. You can see the crest again in the lower right corner. So this is these kind of prints were a great form of advertising. This kind of thing is what we would think of as today as a product placement. And these prints are indeed very, very important. This is how information about the latest fashions was circulated. They provide inspiration for dress as well as advertising. And they were also very cheap. A single sheet print, this is a 3-sheet print, a single sheet print cost just as much as a double helping of noodles. So that's really quite cheap. They were cheap, ephemeral things. So they were consumed as we consume fashion imagery today. Now we use this print as a bit of inspiration ourselves in the exhibition, trying to show sort of different ways that we could think about how we could display objects to make the displays kind of enticing. So we practiced here in our store with sort of lots of boxes standing in for the objects and a tensor barrier stand standing in for the candlestick. But this is how it looks in the final display. Another issue that we faced in the exhibition was trying to find men. I mentioned at the beginning that both men and women wore kimono and they're the same basic shape. But clothing conventions meant that men's garments tend to be darker hues, subtle patterning compared to women's, particularly young women's. Though men, about tag, are still cut an elegant dash, their kimono is not preserved. We did see the blue one earlier, but it's very, very rare. So it's hard to find men, if you like. Prints tend to emphasize beautiful women. So to try and show that men wore kimono as well was a bit of a challenge for us. Shunga, Japanese erotic prints, are always a good way of finding men. And so we see here on the right, this is a sort of two lovers having an amorous encounter outdoors. And we see that the man here is just wearing a striped hakama. These are the trousers that are worn by men over their kimono, and a very sort of small stencil dyed kimono, which is really sort of showing the sort of subtlety of menswear. The other young man on the screen, a fashionable youth, is known as a wakashu, and that just means adolescent male in Japanese. But wakashu didn't have the social responsibility of adult men, but they were normally sexually active and often have relationships with older men and with women of their own age and older. And the kimono they wore, I don't know if you can see here, the kimono he's wearing has very, very long sleeves with plum blossom design at the bottom, much like women of his own age. But we know he's a man. He's wearing stripy hakama, he's got 2 swords, and the head of his hair here is shaved. So he still has his forelock, that would be shaved off at when he ends his teenage years, but this is how you can spot that he's a man here. He's also standing in quite a sort of coquettish way with his foot, and his hand is concealed under his sleeve. This is considered sort of quite erotic in Japan. Wakashu sometimes served as entertainers and prostitutes, and here female attendants from a wealthy household have summoned 3 wakashu to entertain them. I don't know if you can see you can just about spot the shaved head here, but the 2 standing figures and the person playing the shamisen, the musical instrument, are young male prostitutes. They have elaborate hairstyles and they wear kimono of the style of women. And this kind of gender fluidity and sexual ambiguity was really a feature of the Edo period culture and fashion. Wakashu had performed in the popular kabuki theatre, but they were banned in the 1660s, and indeed women had been banned even earlier than that. So the kabuki theatre was, all the actors were adult men, but it still acted as quite a subversive and seductive space. And it was at the heart of what we call the floating world, ukiyo. And the prints I've been showing you are known as ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world. And this was a world of glamour, entertainment, and eroticism in which fashionable dress played a very important part. Men, actors were the great heartthrobs of their day, and the clothes they wore on and off stage were eagerly emulated. On the right is Ichikawa Danjiro VII, who famously wore this costume with the design of a sickle which is kama in Japanese, a circle meaning wa, and a character for nu. Together that makes kamawanu, which means I don't give a damn. So all his fans would rush out and buy fabrics or even just handkerchiefs dyed in this witty pattern. As I mentioned, kabuki actors are all men, and the female parts are often played by men who specialise in those roles. They're known as onagata, and they were seen as the epitome of feminine style, and their style of dress, and they often wore women's dress off stage as well as on, was emulated by fashionable women. Bando Shuka in the print on the left, he's an onagata, and here he's playing a notorious female thief, and you can see he's wearing a very distinctive skeleton's kimono. So we were very excited when we were looking through collections in Japan, that in a private collection we found the kimono that you can see here in the middle. We actually found the kimono first, and had a lot of discussion about who on earth would have worn a garment such as this. And it was only when I came back to the museum and did some research that I found the print. Now, of course, we don't know that the costume was inspired by this actor, but it certainly echoes some of the outlandish spirit of kabuki. We also don't know really whether it was worn by a man or a woman. This kimono on the left was undoubtedly worn by a man. Along the shoulders are pairs of characters, 3 on the back, 2 on the front. Calligraphy is often incorporated into kimono design. It's usually poetry, and it enables the wearer to show something of their cultural discernment. This is slightly different to what's happening here. The characters read quite simply: red hawk, purple hawk, yellow hawk, young hawk, and dancing hawk. The words seem to merely augment the decoration of hawks, which I hope you can see in the bottom part of the kimono. But in the Edo period, the word hawk has the connotations of nighthawk, meaning a prostitute, and a shift in syllable groupings and phonetic emphasis lead to a very different reading of the characters, which suggest a conversation between 2 men about visiting a prostitute. In this kind of teasing playfulness, the kimono epitomizes the style and wit of merchant class taste in 18th century Japan. The man who wore this was presumably a denizen of the pleasure quarters, the most famous of which was the Yoshiwara in Edo. Its great spectacle was the procession of high-ranking courtesans in the most elaborate of attire. Courtesans and images of them relied on gorgeous costume. Famous courtesans were the fashion icons, admired by women for their style and taste. And the garment on the right you can see here is one of those we styled on, another one that we styled on a mannequin, because again, it was an outer kimono, so it didn't have to be wrapped with a sash. Obviously, we thought about this quite carefully because we don't have all the under kimono that would have been worn. We didn't want to leave our mannequin naked underneath the top layer. So we had a lot of discussion about how we should do this and whether we should try and create facsimile garments underneath. But we felt not only would that obviously be quite complicated and difficult to do, it might be a bit confusing for our audiences. So again, our textile mounters made very simple kimono, which you can see are more or less the same color as the mannequin. And I think you can see here that for this particular garment worn by a courtesan, the obi is at the front, because courtesans would always wear their obi at the front, obviously make it much easier to undress. So here we really have a world where those with cash to splash demand the latest styles, where kimono makers and retailers and print publishers take advantage of the commercial opportunities, and this is all fed by a celebrity culture. So this is very much as we think of fashion today. For those not able to buy extravagantly patterned silks, bold checks on cotton were a real favourite, especially in the summer. So popular were they that sometimes the origin of the pattern was forgotten, and their origin was India. For most of the Edo period, Japan operated a closed country policy that severely restricted foreign relations. Despite that, it was part of quite a dynamic global network of cultural exchange through the trading of the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch were the only Europeans permitted to trade in Japan at this time, and they brought to the country exotic goods from other parts of Asia, particularly cloth. The bulk of that cloth was striped and checked cotton from India. And this piece of cloth that you see on the kimono would have been created on the Coromandel Coast in India, but was brought to Japan, was made into an undergarment for a man. In other words, this is something of a sort of flamboyant layer that a man would have worn underneath, perhaps a more restrained exterior. Foreign cloth is known as sarasa in Japan, and in the middle here you can see another undergarment for a man, woven from Indian fabric, tailored from Indian fabric of the type that we would think of as chintz. On the right, we have a courtesan with writing to a lover, surrounded by a padded sleeping garment of sarasa fabric. And it's probably not from India, but is the kind of fabric that was created in Japan to emulate the very, very popular Indian cloth. It's called wa sarasa in Japan. On the left is something slightly more unusual, however. This is a kimono made out of French brocade. So this is silk that was woven in Lyon, in France, in the 1760s. It would have been woven to be made into fashionable suits for men in Europe. The balsa cloth was taken to Amsterdam and taken on a ship to Japan, possibly as a diplomatic gift of some kind, and was made into a woman's kimono for a high-ranking samurai woman. And these objects are on display in the second section of the exhibition, which deals with fashionable exchange. We show here both sides of the story. Sorry, this is a rather sort of fisheye camera view to get both sides in. And you can see that I hope you can see on the left here, the brocade garment is another one that we've styled on a mannequin to give some sense of how it looked when it was worn. But of course, we can only imagine what it might have looked like being worn by a samurai woman. But we do have visual evidence of the other side of the story. 100 years before that balsa cloth reached Japan, Anna Elizabeth van Reed, mistress of Slottsummen Castle outside Utrecht, had her portrait painted. This life-size image reflected her style and her status, and as you can see, she has chosen to wear what looks like a kimono. An inventory from the castle from about 15 years later reveals 3 such garments in the household. They're known as Japonse rok in the Netherlands, Japanese robes. So as well as bringing cloth to Japan, the Dutch took kimono back to Europe, where the garments caused a great stir. Now, the wearing of loose robes was not unknown in Europe. Wearing such a garment really marked you out as a sort of man of letters, because it would usually be men who would wear them, sort of a scholar. They were made out of grey or brown wool, sometimes velvet, sometimes lined with fur, because obviously it's quite cold sitting around reading in your library. Suddenly, there were Japanese robes, colourful, lightweight. They arriving on European stores, they made an immediate impact. So the Dutch began to commission from the Japanese artisans a particular style of kimono with sort of modified sleeves. So the sleeves are more tubular rather than long, and with extra silk padding. Now, only a very few of these garments survive, and as you might imagine, most of them are in the Netherlands. So this boldly patterned garment on the left is typical of the Japonse rok shipped to Europe at this time. So for somebody living in the chilly environs of Northern Europe, this garment was wonderfully warm as well as luxurious and fashionable. The garment on the right is a recent discovery in Scotland, in Newhales House, which is just outside Edinburgh. And it was taken over a few years ago by the National Trust of Scotland. And it's one of those occasions where somebody writes you an email where they just say, we found this object, we don't know what it is, and usually it's not something particularly exciting. And I opened the email and found what I think is the only one of these garments that survives in Britain. So very, very exciting to find and wonderful to have on display. The robe pattern for the robe was obviously relatively straightforward. So tailors in Europe started to make these kind of robes for customers here. The garment on the left was made in London from Spitalfield silk. And these kind of robes are actually called nightgowns in Britain. They're not for wearing in bed, they're for wearing for informal occasions at home. It's perfectly acceptable to have to welcome your guests wearing one, and of course to have your portrait painted. In fact, it would show you that you were cosmopolitan and stylish and probably quite wealthy. And in the V&A collection, we have these wonderful dolls, late 17th century dolls called Lord and Lady Clapham. And they're remarkable in that they have their entire wardrobe, even down to their underwear and their stockings and their shoes, all miniatures of fashionable styles that are worn at the time. And they normally sit, as you see at the top of the picture, in their formal going out wear in our British galleries. But they also have their own kimono style nightgowns in their wardrobe. So for these, they've been dressed in those for appearance in our exhibition. Now, the actual contact between Japan and the rest of the world was quite limited in the Edo period, but in the late 19th century, Japan was forced to open its ports to foreign powers and to international trade. The pressure of this Western intrusion, added to growing internal unrest, led to the overthrow of the shogun in 1868 and the restoration of the power of the emperor, the Meiji emperor as he's known. And many men of the new order started to wear Western dress as a mark of Japan's modernization. and that the fact that they were wanted to take their place as equals on the world stage. Some women did too, as you can see in the print on the right, but most continued to wear kimono. These were often in matching layers. Now, I've always said that kimono were worn in layers, but usually you choose your own layer. Now, makers started to produce ones that were actually designed to match. And here we have, you can see my colleague Elizabeth Ann, who's one of our textile conservators, again, putting the garments, the two garments you can see on the left, on a mannequin. So we had to try and style the mannequin so that you could see both the inner garment and the outer garment at the same time. You can see the decoration here is very, very subtle, just very small, right on the hem of the two garments. Japanese textile manufacturers were quick to realize that there were new markets to be had. First of all, creating garments for Western customers who came to Japan, the growing numbers of Americans and Europeans who came to Japan, but then for direct export. The Japanese silk merchant Shino Shobei established what is arguably the world's first global fashion brand. In 1859, he established a shop in Yokohama, the year that this treaty port was established. He exported silk garments and accessories to Europe and America. So the shape of this garment that you can see on the left is totally European, but in its soft quilted silk and its colourful embroidery, it's distinctly Japanese. And these kind of garments would be bought in shops such as Liberty's in London. Now, the opening of the hitherto rather mysterious country had aroused enormous interest in Europe and America, and the subsequent flood of goods that reached our shores led to a craze for all things Japanese. And this fashionable dress on the right was made by the London dressmaking sisters Margaret and Emma Turner, who skillfully recut and retailored a kimono that had been made in Japan for a high-ranking woman of the samurai class. I hope you can see it's quite similar in its colouring and patterning as the kimono I showed you earlier on. So for the woman who wore this dress, it would have had quite a familiar structure, but would nonetheless have an exciting foreign appearance. Wearing kimono itself is also incredibly popular. On the left is the famous actress Ellen Terry. She's not wearing the kimono as a theatrical costume, but as a signifier of her avant-garde bohemian lifestyle. With the end of the samurai, merchants in Japan were left with a lot of unsold stock. So they sold it to all these eager Western customers. And many of the garments that made their way to Britain and America and to Europe at this time were samurai garments. It's the case with the dress we just saw, with Ellen Terry's garment, and the one you can see in the middle. And it was bought or acquired by Elizabeth Smith, who was the wife of George Murray Smith, the very famous publisher. And you can see she chose to wear the kimono for her when she had her portrait painted. And I hope you can just about see she put 3 buttons on the kimono to help her secure it. And what's remarkable is not only this very beautiful painting, but the garment she's wearing survives. And as far as we know, it is the only surviving pair where the kimono in the picture survives. So culturally and geographically transposed, these garments became part of an aestheticized space where they evoked the novelty and the exoticism, if you like, of Japan. And Japan was often viewed as this sort of idealized sort of country, living in sort of the romantic Middle Ages, a place where the people were innately artistic and lived in harmony with nature and understood social deference and so on. So these kind of perceived social and cultural traits were admired, but never without the firm conviction of Western superiority. So it could be said that could you actually say that wearing kimono was an example of sort of cultural imperialism? To an extent, yes, but it's not quite as straightforward, because these kind of garments really offered women a different kind of individual choice about what they would wear. It showed their kind of involvement in modern sort of artistic styles. It also suggested a type of clothing free of corsets, and the kimono was taken up as the dress reform movement as a possible sort of style of dress. And while the East-West balance of power was certainly unequal, it is important to remember that Japan was not a passive player in this relationship. Indeed, recognizing the popularity of such garments in the West, Japanese started to make specific kimono for foreigners, such as the one on the left. Its shiny silk fabric and bold embroidery is very different from the kind of things that would have been made for the domestic market at this time, the one we saw slightly earlier. Also, interestingly, it has a sash made out of the same fabric, rather than having to wear a separate obi. And perhaps most interestingly, it has extra panels. Kimono for foreigners had extra panels at the side, or as here, in the central seam. There's a sort of gored section in the central back, which enabled these garments to be worn over petticoats. So they draped a little bit more like a skirt. In the middle, you see these two wonderful women at the races in Paris in 1913. The woman on the left wears an export kimono over petticoats with even an obi-like sash. And the woman on the right is wearing a kind of dress very similar to that you can see on the right, which in its cylindrical form, its crossover front and its high sash is you can see has taken inspiration from kimono. And this was designed by Lucille, the designer named for Lady Duff Gordon, who famously survived the sinking of the Titanic, apparently wearing a mauve kimono and a fox fur. Kimono had a radical impact on European fashions of the early 20th century. Highly structured, tightly corseted garments were abandoned in favour of straight seams and fabric that draped on the shoulders. The purple mantle you can see on the left was owned by the American socialite Emily Grigsby, who also had an export kimono in her wardrobe. And the Fortuny coat is essentially constructed like an open kimono. It's even made out of fabric inspired by kimono fabric. And even the archetypal flapper dress, with its straight seams, is very much inspired by East Asian dress forms. And this one here even has an obi-like function at the back. European fashions were adopted by some women in Japan, but the vast majority continued to wear kimono. So this dramatic, colourful designs of the early 20th century, you can see here, this very extravagant kimono on the left, the delicacy and the sense of depth that we've seen in kimono in the past has really been abandoned. There's a real sense of immediacy. Bright chemical dyes have been used to create this very, very dramatic garment. The kimono-clad woman descending the stairs in the 1930s is the epitome of modern sophistication. Her bright red lipstick matches her fingernails. She's got a clutch bag under her arm, fox fur over her shoulders. So by wearing a kimono, a modern fashionable woman could demonstrate she'd not completely abandoned Japanese values, but by embracing the modern styles, hairstyles, and makeup, she could show she was no reactionary either. The early 20th century kimono are more robust, so we were able to style some of them on mannequins with obi and other accessories. But of course, we don't actually have those obi and other accessories. So we had this wonderful afternoon shopping in Vintage Shop in Tokyo. In the center here, you can see Koko Yoshimura, who comes from Bunka Gakuen, one of the great fashion colleges of Japan, where she's a researcher and a lecturer. She helps us do the shopping, and I should introduce my colleagues here. In the red and black spots is Josephine Rout, who's the co-curator of the exhibition, and on the left is Masami Yamada, who also helped us curatorially with the exhibition. Now, I was pleased I actually managed to choose obi that were of the right age, but every time I chose something, Mr. Yoshimura would keep saying to me, "Too tasteful, Anna." Because what you had to go for in this period was something really clashy. So she chose this sort of pink obi with carnations, which I don't suppose I would have chosen, but it looks great when styled up, particularly in the setting of the room, which at the time of our shopping expedition, we did not realize was actually going to be pink. And I hope you can see it here in the far end of the case on the left. As in the Edo period, images of celebrities wearing kimono were utilized. This is an advertisement starring a well-known actress. The advert is for meisen, which is a kind of silk that was more durable, cheap, boldly decorated with patterns, often as here, this is a water pattern, so a real sort of enlargement and abstraction of what is quite a historic kind of motif. And again, this is one we styled on a mannequin, and this is Miss Yoshimura. She spent 3 weeks with us just before the opening of the exhibition, helping us with all the styling, again with accessories we bought with her in Tokyo. Other meisen kimono were very, you can see there's sort of an inspiration of the West. I always think the one on the left looks like roses of Charles Manning Mackintosh. In the middle, you've got what is essentially a kimono that evokes sort of modern cities with a skyscraper and the bright lights at night. And then very unusually, perhaps on the right, you have something which doesn't have a motif at all, very unusually up until that point in kimono design, just a completely abstract kind of spontaneous looking patterning, which sort of makes you think of the sort of speed of modern life. And these kimono were bought off the peg. They weren't mass produced in the way that we would think of them now, but they were batch produced using stencils. And for the first time, women could go into the modern department stores that had evolved from the traditional kimono stores, and buy something like this off the peg. Now, I hope you've seen from some of the images I've shown you already the wonderful environments and scenography that were created for us by Story Studio. And we really wanted with these garments to show something about this notion of this kind of abundance and how colourful these mason kimono were. So we had thought of making perhaps a wall of garments, but our designers instead created an octagonal room with 2 levels using mirrors. But the results, I think you can see, is one of the most stunning parts of the exhibition. This rather amazing period of cross-cultural interaction and influence and exciting kimono fashions came to an end in the mid-20th century. The Pacific War caused irrevocable changes to Japan's cultural landscape. In the second half of the 20th century, the wearing of kimono declined dramatically. The status and meaning of kimono shifted from being everyday fashionable wear to a kind of codified ceremonial costume you only wore on special occasions, such as a sort of wedding, or if you were doing the tea ceremony or flower arranging. And the kimono came to be treasured and revered as the essence of what was Japanese in an increasingly globalized world. This is the image we now have of the kimono, an unchanging, traditional and somewhat restrictive garment to wear that has to be worn in a very particular way. And this is really what it was for Yukiko Yoshi, who wore this kimono for her coming of age ceremony when she was 20. And she never wore kimono. She had no desire for a kimono. She really wanted her parents to buy her a car. But instead, they spent probably the same amount of money buying this incredibly lavish kimono ensemble. The car from 1991 perhaps wouldn't have survived, but of course we do still have the ensemble. With the Allied occupation, Japanese culture became increasingly Americanized in the 1950s, and in response, the government made efforts to ensure that historic practices, including weaving and dyeing, were preserved and protected. In 1955, they established a system whereby important techniques and those skilled practitioners who worked with them were designated intangible cultural properties. Holders of this honor are popularly known as living national treasures, such as Moriguchi Kunihiko, who creates these wonderfully abstract graphic designs. And his kimono are collected around the world, shown in museums such as the V&A. This one's from the Kalili collection. But he, again, is very, very conscious that these are garments that are made to be worn, that are brought to life by the personality of the wearer. It's always great to meet a living national treasure. So in November, we took a press tour to Japan. We took our journalists to see him, and he talked through the very sort of complex design process he has. And this is Jess Cartner-Morley, from the fashion journalist from The Guardian. Our images of the kimono in the second half of the 20th century is often mediated through film. The great Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa gave a sense of a world in which kimono were worn by everyone. The V&A has the ensemble worn by the legendary Toshiro Mifune in Sanjuro. And these films and these costumes did much to shape the prevalent idea of the and the image of the samurai as swashbucklingly modest heroes. Hollywood has given us a more romantic, stereotypical image in Memoirs of a Geisha, adopted from Arthur Golden's best-selling book. The fabulous costumes, 2 of which we have on display, won designer Colleen Atwood an Oscar. They have a real central role in the film, and they really cemented the image of the kimono-clad geisha as the ultimate signifier of Japan. The kimono is rather a remarkable garment, however. While it's often viewed as traditional and specifically Japanese, its seemingly timeless quality means it can be simultaneously universal and futuristic. Nowhere is this universal quality more powerfully and evocatively realized than in that famous galaxy far, far away. The Star Wars character Obi-Wan Kenobi was equal parts Zen Buddhist monk and noble samurai. George Lucas has acknowledged his great debt to Kurosawa, and apparently originally thought of offering the part of Obi-Wan to Mifune, which is possibly why the character has a Japanese name. Interesting performers often wear kimono-esque garments. Kimono are exotic, but they also have an ambiguity that allows for multiple meanings, giving artists an opportunity to explore their sexual and cultural identity. Freddie Mercury wore kimono on and off stage, and Madonna wore this Scarlett Jean Paul Gaultier kimono ensemble for her music video, Nothing Really Matters. For the cover of her 1997 album Homogenic, Bjork collaborated with designer Alexander McQueen, photographer Nick Knight, and stylist Katie England. And the resulting image combined cultural references with this kimono-style dress, hair inspired by Native American tribes. But by drawing on sort of non-Western ideals of power and beauty, Bjork refashioned herself as a futuristic warrior goddess. Of course, dressing in kimono or kimono-inspired styles is not without its problem. and it could lead to potential accusations of cultural appropriation. And this is something we've thought about quite carefully in the exhibition. The issue is a sort of complex and obviously a very sensitive one. Can you actually say that anybody who wears a non-Japanese person wearing a kimono or something kimono inspired is sort of modern manifestation of cultural imperialism? Such claims are often based on the notion that the kimono has very specific national and cultural significance that should remain untouched, unsullied. But the danger of that kind of criticism is that you go down that route of accepting a very reductive and orientalizing image of the kimono, which actually reinforces the stereotype of Asian clothing as unchanging costume. This denies the kimono its own dynamic sartorial history and its part in an ongoing, complex and vibrant international fashion network. It's important to note that Japan has always had agency in both the sharing of its culture and adapting Western elements into Japanese life. As we can say, have seen, there's quite a layered complexity in the way that fashion has been historically translated across cultural boundaries. Since the 1950s, many designers, including Japanese designers, have absorbed the tenets of kimono. The potential of the garment to be deconstructed and reformed, translated and transformed, makes it quite universally versatile as an item of fashion. In the early 1960s, Rudy Gernrich used the kimono for a basis of a series of mini dresses. The kabuki dress on the left has a bright obi-like feature and that kind of bold check that we saw that was so popular in the Edo period. Rei Kawakubo, designer of Comme des Garçons, we don't often think of her as sort of drawing particularly on her Japanese heritage, but in this particular collection from 1991, she asked a kimono painter, someone who paints on the surface of kimono, a kimono designer, to create the pattern on the surface, and the big padded hem is very much like outer kimono. Meanwhile, Sydney-based fashion designer Akira Isagawa grew up in Kyoto, but is celebrated in his adopted home for creating designs that merge kimono elements with a relaxed Australian attitude. Until recently, however, the future for kimono itself was looking very bleak. Now Japan is witnessing something of a kimono renaissance. This started on the street with a restyling of vintage kimono by younger Japanese who perhaps didn't have the associations of kimono that their parents or grandparents had, and they were tired of the incessant changes in Western fashion and bored by the uniformity of global clothing. In the past, the latest fashion ideas were circulated through prints and pattern books. Today, it's social media and the internet. This is how Akira's radical inventive work has gained global understanding and a great global following. Using the moniker Akira Times, the self-taught photographer and stylist is dedicated to breaking down the boundaries of kimono conservatism. And we have a film on our website showing how he creates his work if you're interested. A new wave of designers has recently emerged in Japan who approach the creation of kimono in fresh kind of ways. This is Jotaro Saito. We saw him right at the beginning. As I said, he takes part in, we met him in his Kyoto studio. We took our journalist to Japan. He showed us the garment that is actually the one on display right at the beginning of the show. And he shows on the Tokyo Catwalk. And again, there's a film on our website. There are also sort of more independent designers. This is Rumi Rock. Rumi Shibasaki is seen as sort of a pioneer of these kind of new kimono designs, often with a bit of a gothic edge. Here, though, we chose the exhibition and for our collections something with Edo period hairstyles on it. As you can see, we couldn't resist shopping in her tiny studio, which is in Yoshiwara in the former pleasure district of Tokyo. This is Masami, and with Kazuoka Kaneko, who cuts the stencils that are used for the creation of the designs. And I don't know if you can see what I'm wearing today, but I am in a Rumi Rock kimono, which has got bats on it, which I've dressed up just for this occasion. And then you've got Modern Antenna, based in Kyoto, their designer Hirayama. He loves contemporary design, British rock music. His kimono are digitally printed on polyester, so they're not as expensive as silk garments. And again, we were waiting there for a taxi for rather a long time once, so he dressed us in his kimono. And it's not really an issue. We asked all our designers how they would feel about Westerners wearing their kimono. And of course, for them, it's important that these kind of garments survive, so they would, actively encourage it. For this part of the show, our designers created this wonderful futuristic garden. And here we showed both whereas before we showed Japanese garments and what was happening in the rest of the world separately, in the final section of the show, we show everything together. I mentioned about kimono essentially being sort of gender neutral garments, and there's been a real revival in kimono for men in Japan recently. Shizukiya on the right is intent on bringing a bit of samurai swagger back to men's wear. Collaborations, of course, very important in the modern design world. The T kimono range is a collaboration between the Norwegian tailor and designer T. Michael, this is him on the left, and the Japanese kimono company Y & Sons. And their aim is really to make a kimono a staple of men's wardrobes once again. And here in the middle, we have Tom Brown, who took it, the famous New York designer, who took his inspiration from kimono primarily through its imagery. Tea kimono's clients are women as well as men, and many designers are consciously making unisex garments, including Jotaro Saito and Hiroko Takahashi, who we see in the middle here. This is actually her wearing her garment here. Duro Oloa, we also have in the exhibition, who's a Nigerian-born designer based in London, who's very much got a global approach to fashion. Here he finds a sort of sartorial synergy between the kimono and the buba, a Yoruba garment. And one of the next generation, Milligan Beaumont, who you see here on the left, combines her love of urban style and skateboarding, and the way that the kimono can tell a story, much the way that it did in the Edo period. Her kimono hoodie collection for her degree show at Central St. Martin's in 2015 was all sold to Christina Aguilera. So she created a special garment, Fuji Heartbreak, especially for the show. It was wonderful to welcome all our designers, all dressed on brand, of course, to the opening party of the exhibition on the 26th of February. And I think what is quite heartening really about it as well is that many of these younger kimono designers, they don't necessarily know each other very well or communicate. Certainly the young independent students don't know Jotaro Saito because he lives in a slightly different world. So it was great to kind of almost bring these people together because a lot of them have talked about collaborating in the future in Japan, which is very, very nice. And I don't know if you can spot also Josephine Masami and I dressed up in our kimono and kimono-inspired garments to celebrate with the team who created the exhibition. Little did we know that 3 weeks after these pictures were taken that our beautiful exhibition, the product of 4 years of hard work, would close. And we made a film just before lockdown, now available on 5 short episodes on YouTube, on the V&A's YouTube channel, if you'd like to watch. And we do plan to open again when the V&A does. Of course, dates are still a little bit uncertain, but we hope the show will be available again in September and October. So hopefully some of you will be able to see it for yourself and see how, from the sophisticated culture of 17th century Japan to the creativity of the contemporary catwalk, the kimono has been subject to both local and global reinventions, while always retaining something of its essential Japaneseness, giving it a very unique place in the story of global fashion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for such a very rich and truly absorbing talk. We have a few minutes for some questions, and naturally there are quite a few, and I apologize to the audience that we can't answer all of them, but one question from, for instance, Joshua, sorry, I just lost the page, I just need to go up again. Just a moment. Yeah, a question. Sophie Godfroy, you mentioned that these are indeed viewed as a timeless style of clothing. This may be perhaps difficult to ascertain. However, would you say that the kimono's timelessness is comparable or superior to the frequently reinvented styles of classical Greek or Roman times?
Possibly, but it has more continuity in the sense that it has been worn consistently in Japan. I mean, it first emerged in sort of the medieval period as a form of underclothing. And so from the 16th century, it's been worn consistently until that point. And it's still got sort of quite a lively heritage in Japan. It was really only the war and the sort of attitudes changing after the war that really meant that people stopped wearing kimono. And now I think in Japan, there's a sort of sense that it has to be worn in a particular way, and it's quite rigid, and that again is relaxing. So all, of course, young kimono designers, we don't really know what the future holds, but they obviously very much hope that kimono do have a future, and it just becomes another choice in a fashionable wardrobe, that you might choose to wear Western style fashions one day or a kimono the next. And of course, you can style it up any way you like. You can wear a kimono jacket over a pair of jeans and things. So it has more of perhaps a continuity in terms of how the West has been influenced. You can certainly see it works in a kind of waves. Obviously, there was the first period when kimono came to Europe, were brought by the Dutch, and that kind of popularity seems to go between in Britain. Charles II is seen as the person starting the craze in the 1660s, and it goes through for about a century, and then it sort of dies off again, and then it comes back to life in the 19th century when suddenly all these actual kimono are reaching the West, and then it has an impact on the early 20th century. So I think certainly it sort of works in ways. And when we're looking at we were looking at garments to show in the last section, there seems to be a real sort of interest in the 70s, and then again in the 90s. And then, of course, if you look up kimono fashion today, what you get is all those kimono jackets that you can buy in H&M and Zara and things like that, which became popular, I don't know, sort of about 2013, 2015, as a sort of thing you could wear in the summer for festival wear and things like that. So I think it is a kind of, often fashion inspiration works in that way, that it is a kind of wave.
One last quick question by Joshua Williams. As environmental sustainability is a huge challenge the fashion industry faces, what can contemporary fashion designers learn from the kimono?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because I think a lot of this sort of, as I said, the initial interest in sort of this revival of kimono that happened probably about 15, 20 years ago in Japan, was that notion that disposable fashion wasn't good. And what was originally done was this idea of using vintage garments, the ones from the 20s and 30s, which aren't particularly expensive, and restyling them. And that's certainly, I think, part of the drive now. Though the kimono we've acquired for the exhibition have all been newly made for us and so on, kimono are made very beautifully, and the idea is that you keep them, and they are very individual to you, what pattern you might choose, but you could style them up in any way you like. That you could change your obi and all your accessories and things like that. So there's still things that, if you look after your kimono, it will last you a lifetime. Mm-hmm. So it is, I think that sustainability, I don't know if that's what inspired a lot of it to begin with, but it's certainly an issue now when people are starting to think about these kind of the creation of clothing, and I think it's quite an important one.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm sorry we don't have more time to go into a proper discussion, but I think what your talk showed us is really that fashion was not exclusively a European invention, and that it was not simply something transferred from Europe to countries such as Japan. Thank you very much. We salute your research. We wish you all the best for the exhibition, and that extraneous circumstances and constraints will not prevent as many people as possible enjoying these fantastic objects. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for watching. Bye-bye.